For as long as there have been preachers, we've been finding stories or anecdotes or illustrations to help explain the scriptures or to help illustrate a point. It's why there's a recurring joke among pastors that preachers are like butchers. They use everything. Or why you might find yourself around a pastor with a mug like this or a t-shirt that says, "Pastor, warning, anything you say or do could be used in a sermon." That's the truth. And in fact, it's been going on since the very beginning of the Christian community. In Paul's letter to the Galatians, he riffs on a story they all know to make a point. And that's where we're headed in this conversation of Freed for Love. So, we've been working our way through Galatians chapter 4 and how Paul has again tried over and over and over again to make sense of how we can be in right relationship with God apart from our ability to follow the rules, keep the commandments, observe the rituals and prescriptions of the old, the ancient covenants of Israel. And we saw before, he sort of used the imagery of like, well, it's sort of like when you have a guardian or a custodian or like a governess in the old, British nanny days, someone whose job is to oversee the safety of the children, and until they come of age, they are under the authority of the governess, of the custodian, of the disciplinarian or teacher, you might say. But the idea is you're always a member of the family, apart from your ability to follow the rules that the governess might sense. So he's tried to make that kind of point. Now Paul takes a different tack, and he borrows from a story in ancient Israel's memory, right? Remember, he's not only speaking to Gentile Christians who have to hear the good news that they belong as Gentiles, but he's also speaking to Jewish Christians who, some of whom may have thought, well, the reason that God accepts us is because we were so good at keeping the covenant. And Paul's tried to say, no. And yet to appeal to those stories, the ancient memory and heritage of ancient Israel that we call the Torah, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Scripture, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, which is not just a bunch of laws and commandments, but stories about their ancestors, Abraham and his descendants. So Paul does something interesting. He says, all right, how about I tell you a story? How about I give you an allegory? Allegory is one of those interesting literary devices where you take a story and each thing is meant to represent something else in the real world or in your current experience. It's using a story that is either easy to follow or already well known so that you can explain a point that might be not as familiar. So, for example, if you've ever read the childhood favorite, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobes from C.S. Lewis's Narnia Chronicles, and you recognize Aslan the Lion dying and rising again, and you thought, I've seen that plot device before, that's Jesus, right? That's an allegory about Christ, where Aslan the Lion stands for Jesus, and his death on the stone table stands for the cross, that kind of thing. Or maybe you remember having to read Animal Farm at some point in your high school education, and you wondered why you would have to read a story as a high schooler about a farm where the animals take over and run out the humans, and then the pigs in the farm end up being as bad or worse than the human farmers were in the first place. And it turns out that's an allegory too. That's really about the Russian Revolution, about the communist revolution in Russia and how they ran out the Tsar, but also then the new party heads became just as cruel and authoritarian as the people they tried to replace, right? That's how an allegory works. Taking a story where each piece in the story is meant to correspond to something else, so that if you can understand how the story works, you can understand the point that's trying to be made. Again, it's why pastors and preachers tell stories and anecdotes in their sermons, right? As they're trying to make a point about what the Bible is saying, they'll use a story, and usually something in the story is meant to correspond to whatever's going on in the biblical text. With me so far? So Paul says, let me do that now. Let me give you an allegory for the story of Abraham and the mothers of his 2 sons. This gets into the weeds a little bit in your memory about good old Father Abraham. A lot of folks know Abraham as the father of Isaac, and his name means laughter, and how they'd waited for this son, and they laughed when they had a son because they didn't think it was possible. We sometimes forget or edit out that before that, Abraham and Sarah doubted that there would ever be a child in their family despite God's promise. And so they take matters into their own hands, and Abraham takes Hagar, the servant of Sarah, and fathers a child with her, who becomes Ishmael. And that child, as the son born to a servant or slave in their household, is also sort of regarded as enslaved or in servitude. This is not Abraham or Sarah's finest hour, of course. And part of what Paul is going to try and do is to say, imagine if you can remember that Abraham has Sarah as his spouse and eventually has Isaac, the child of promise, through whom God keeps the promise to Abraham. And Abraham also has son Ishmael by Hagar, and they've got these two mothers, and one is a free mother. Sarah is free, right? And even though she was believed to be too old to have children, because God made a promise to them, God gave them a child, and this wonderful thing happened through Sarah, but then there's Hagar, through whom this child Ishmael is born, who's born into servitude because his mom was enslaved. And so Paul says, if you can understand those two differences, I'm trying to suggest that the law way of life is like Hagar and Ishmael, which is a life that's sort of born into servitude. And the promised way of life, the way of life about faith and trust in a promise, is like Sarah and her son Isaac, who is given as a sheer gift of God's promise, keeping the promise made to Abraham and Sarah to give them a descendant through their very own line and their very own family, not with Hagar, not with an outsider. And then Paul goes on further to say, really, it's like not only do we have two mothers, Sarah and Hagar, and two ways of relating to God, the law and the promise, but it's really like they correspond to two mountains. The mountain of the law, Sinai, where the commandments are given, and Jerusalem, where God promises to make things new and to bring about God's new creation. Again, once a preacher gets riffing on things, they start making connections all over the place. Paul's intention is to say, you all know the story of Abraham and how he's got Sarah and Hagar, and the family's story traces the promise through Sarah's child, Isaac, and through the sheer grace that God gives them a child even when it seemed impossible. So Paul says that's what God's doing in Christ, that God's doing this in some ways old ancient thing, not brand new, that God is simply continuing the line just like God had made a promise, and the most Abraham and Sarah could do is to trust a promise. That's how God is continuing in the way of faith. And Paul's point is to say that if you pin all your hopes on the commandments and how well you can keep the covenants, it's like you're aligning yourself with Hagar and Ishmael, who are the path of servitude. Again, there are problems with any time you use an analogy or a story or an allegory. At some point, any analogy breaks down. And there's certainly problematic things about comparing the whole ancient Sinai covenant with Hagar and Ishmael. And there's also plenty of reason to critique Abraham and Sarah for having a slave in their household rather than setting her free, or not treating her the way they treated her, the way that story goes. But for the purposes of the story, for the purpose of trying to make his point, Paul is just trying to zero in on, okay, if you can understand there's these two mothers, Sarah and Hagar, and you want to be on Team Sarah rather than Team Hagar because she's the free woman rather than the enslaved woman. You want to live the life of freedom, so the way of Sarah is the way you want to go. Paul's point is to say, if you want to be in relationship with God and you want to have the freedom that God gives, don't follow the path that leads to servitude. Don't follow the path of being enslaved to defining everything in your life in terms of, did I keep the rules well enough? Now, for us, 2,000 years later, this might seem like going to a lot of lengths to try and make a point. And for Paul, yeah, that's what he's doing. It's worth remembering. The object lessons or illustrations that may have connected with a first century audience might not work quite the same way. The same way that if you, say, read a sermon from a preacher 100 years ago or 200 years ago, the illustrations they use might not work quite the same way because technology or our cultural references are different. But if you you can at least understand Paul trying one more time to get through. There's two attempts, there's two different ways people might try and put themselves in relationship with God. Every time you try and put yourself in relationship with God by your ability to follow the rules, keep the commandments, it turns out to be a trick. It turns out to be a trap. It turns out to be like enslaving and constraining and confining. And instead, we're invited to live this way of freedom, trusting in God's grace, trusting that when God makes a promise, God keeps a promise, not on the basis of how good or well-behaved we are. My goodness, Abraham and Sarah certainly show that they mess up from time to time. But trusting a promise is to say, I'm not pinning my hopes on how good or well-behaved I am. I'm trusting that when God makes a promise, God keeps a promise. For all of us, that's really all our hope. That in the end, God's love isn't a reward for good behavior, because in that case, none of us get the reward. But when God gives a gift by grace, the most we can do is trust it. That's where we're headed for this coming week's session in Freed for Love. We invite you to be with us around the table at 1 o'clock on Thursdays here at Community of Christ as we explore these ancient stories and how God continues to speak to us through them. And if you can't be with us in person, join us with these video summary sessions too. See you along the way.